Coming up next is poetry for anyone, everyone. Who reads poetry? Is it the elderly? Is it the young who are forced to read it? What kind of poetry gets read? Is poetry about the poet or is it about the audiences? In a fascinating discussion, we have who is reading poetry. Let's find out from Naveen Kishore, renowned publisher and theatre practitioner, Vinita Agrawal, poet, editor and curator, and the session is led by Arunava Sinha.
To have people back in a real room, actually breathing each other's oxygen and carbon dioxide, instead of being little rectangles on computer windows. So welcome everybody and welcome to both of you for this afternoon's panel, which is very intriguingly titled, Who's Reading Poetry? I only have actually one line in response to that, who's not? Is there anyone who doesn't read poetry? Present company, of course, goes without saying reads poetry, but really, I think we will try and figure out an answer to who's not reading poetry by the end of this half an hour session. But let me start by asking both of you from the perspective of a poet and then from the perspective of a poet and a publisher, who is reading poetry?
Thank you, Arunava. And yes, it's a pleasure to be here. Well, as far as this room is concerned, I'm sure everybody is reading poetry. This is a poetry festival. But the very question about who reads poetry is a very layered one. And I'm not sure whether it can be answered in a definitive or a negative, you know. It's hard to say, do people read poetry outside the writer's circle, the author's circle, the poetry circle? Does an architect, a doctor, a corporate person read poetry? When he can go back home and relax with a book of fiction or non-fiction, why can't he pick up a book of poetry? So there are so many questions that occur to me when I try and think about who reads poetry. And I'd like to, also look at it from my heart and my mind. They say two separate things. My heart says, yes, poetry is being read much more than ever. The number of books that are being published tells us that, yes, poetry is being published and read. But my mind says that there's also something called a sales figure, when poetry books don't sell as much compared to the other genres. So then you step back a little and wonder, are people really reading poetry?
Okay, I thought you were just beginning, but you've completed. Okay, we'll stick for a few more minutes to the idea of poetry existing in the form of books. But of course, it exists well beyond that. But Naveen, as a publisher and a poet who's been writing nearly all his life, even before he got into publishing, and who's been publishing as well. And then Seagull Books, Naveen Seagull Books has actually, I just learned, has published 112 titles of poetry in translation from around the world, which makes him undoubtedly India's biggest poetry publisher and possibly one of the world's largest.
I think the trick is to keep doing it. This is the important thing. By which I mean, this is not something like rocket science or anything new to all of you, which is, in publishing terms, if you want something to circulate, it can take up to 20, 30, 40 years. You have to keep doing the books. You have to build what is known as a backlist. You cannot hope to publish one book of Vinitas and sell it, recover money, and then publish Priya or Arunava. You have to keep building that list. And then one day you wake up to the numbers matching. That's the publishing part of it. In terms of, rather than who is reading, I think in today's world, all of us who are finding our way out of this vast fracturing of the last 2 years, it's more about, to me personally, when are we reading it? Why are we reading it? You know, I've always, for example, read the darkest of books. I grew up on a certain kind of European literature, not because of any other reason, but because for me, as a not very religious person, those books were like the Bible. You opened the page somewhere and something spoke to you. And that's what poetry did for a lot of us, at least in that generation in the 70s and 80s when we were growing up, when it was a much more fertile exchange across borders. Our footpaths were full of books because there was a wonderful old man called Mehra who was bringing them in as Rupa. And, you know, the whole world's literature in translation was available. And then, of course, it disappeared for 2 decades because translation apparently, according to our American friends, doesn't sell. But now, again, it's back after that cycle, and translation is kind of back in vogue and so on and so forth. But, and, you know, just to kind of touch upon what both Vinita and this whole business of reaching out for something that you know you can only sense through the words. There may be words that are not strung together even grammatically often. There may be words that seem alien because they accompany each other in strange relationships. But somehow they get through to you. I know it sounds like romantic mishmash, but they do for those of us who read them in a certain kind of way. So I think it's more about the relationship that you have with language that makes you pick up a book of poems versus anything else.
Do you want to add to that?
Yes, I do. Actually, you know, ever since Sukrita and I have been editing the yearbook, and we get about 700 to 800 submissions every year. So that has given us a sense, in general, I would say that. I mean, it's not just limited to the yearbook. So this has given us a sense that people are definitely writing poetry. And the way to write poetry is to read poetry. So there's an inference somewhere there that if people are mushrooming with their own work and they want to send it out and have it out in an anthology, they're definitely reading poetry somewhere. You know, that path is parallel to writing. So that has given us a good sense that people are definitely writing and reading poetry.
Sure. What have you heard back from your readers? This is now an age where readers can talk directly to writers and poets. So from what you've heard back from your readers, what are you learning about who they are?
Oh, yeah, well, I don't really hear back too often. But when one does hear, it's like it's almost like a passionate plea for, you know, it's almost like being grabbed somewhere on the street and said, thank you so much for doing this. And I'm kind of trying to remember what this is all about. And that's it. It's just someone wanting to thank you for something that you had no idea she or he had read. Because how do you come up with target readers? You can't, as a publisher, decide so-and-so is going to read this book and so-and-so is going to read. You just have to put out what your intuitive, if you're lucky, if your intuition tells you that this is working for half a dozen of you in this room as publishers, let's put it out there and let's see who reads it and so on and so forth. But every now and then, people do write in, people do meet, people do talk, people talk at sessions after sessions like this. And then you get a sense. I, for example, noticed that what in Pankaj Mishra's term, you know, if you remember Butter Chicken in Ludhiana, small town India, which sounds like an anomaly because so many of us. Small town India is reading French and German and Italian translations of my books. I know because I get figures. I get details in this technological age from my distributors more than the metros. And I know this is to be true because in the days of the postcards, I used to get postcards like they used to in those radio programs, you know, Jobri Talaya and, you know, this, that. People writing and saying, we want Mrinal Sen's Akale Shondhane. So that stopped, of course. So the only access I have directly is through distributors, sub-wholesalers, sub-wholesalers, who tend to sell more of this strange esoteric list of seagulls where you're translating from the whole world, Slovakian literature, Arab literature. And somehow it's people out there. And Indians are very eclectic readers. Don't be fooled by, it's all self-help and religion and all of that. No. We're reading all kinds of things. We've traditionally always devoured all kinds of things. But I know a lot of young people come up often at small gatherings, big gatherings, constantly thanking you for the work that you do. So that's the only kind of way we can get feedback. There's no organized feedback system. I can't have a form online and that kind of stuff. I don't know if this answers you a little bit.
No, it does. But of course, when you look at the responses that people put on social media to the poetry that they're reading, both on social media and off it, then you get a sense of what they're thinking and who they are.
Yeah, I was just wondering whether to take this discussion in the direction of the social media, because we were talking about poetry in books for a while. But yes, on the social media, you get an instant gratification kind of a response. It's also sometimes quite falsified. It depends on whether you know the poet and what is your, what's your motivation to give that comment, and whether it's actually genuinely stemming from appreciation or from something else. And also social media poetry is very dichotomized. Some of it is just on Twitter, it's like 140 words. On Insta, it's different. Facebook, you have the entire poem and everything. But not going into that at all and just sticking to the response of the readers, I would just put it in one word. I would say it's gratitude. Either whether for being published or for being read or just for the content of the poem. Gratitude is what I find is the middle name of all the responses on social media.
So I want to dwell on the idea of freeing poetry from the form of the book, but later. First, I still want to talk about the book, because so far we've been thinking about equating the number of people or the kind of people who are reading poetry with the number of copies that you sell of books. Now, what if I were to say that that's really not a good way of looking at it? Because while that may make sense from a publisher or for a poet in terms of how many copies of my book sold, that's not how people read poetry. They may pick up a book, sample 2 pages, move on. You don't necessarily have to buy a book or put it on your shelves to read poetry. And because we now live in an age where we read in small pieces, we don't necessarily do sustained reading, what if we were to say that very many more people are reading poetry because it has become so much more accessible to them, not in terms of what it talks about necessarily, that also, and I want to go to that if time permits, but in terms of being available at hand. You fire up your social media feed and it's there. And it's not just people who are writing exclusively for Instagram or Twitter. Many of my friends and we photograph pages from books and we share them on social media. So entire poems are being passed around. My inbox is full of poems that I'm getting from people I know. My inbox is full of poems I'm getting from my students. And I'm sending them poems. And before I know it, we have about 100, 150, 200 poems being read by a number of people in the course of a week or so. Have you observed this phenomenon, and do you have any comment on that? And I'll put my second question in at the same time to you, Naveen, which is that are you then saying that maybe poetry publishers should stop looking at individual titles being profitable or not profitable, this very pernicious habit of a P&L, but you just say, I publish 100 plus works of poetry. What are they doing for me as a publisher, as a whole, rather than this book or that book? So yeah, 2 different questions, but they occurred to me at the same time, so before I forget.
No, in fact, Arunava, that's a great point. Not just about how much poetry is selling and who's reading, who's not reading, but how is poetry being read and what does it give to the reader? So if I were to just sum it up, I think poetry helps the reader to process ideas. And which is why even at midnight, you might want to keep a poetry book next to your bedside table, on your bedside table, and just read a page. If you've woken up in the middle of the night, it'll give you something. And poetry is read best in the quietest moments of your life and the quietest moments of your mental activity. So yes, poetry in that sense is very, very relevant, and we just come back full circle to this discussion that who reads poetry, not just in terms of figures and quantity, but in the quality of what they take back from a poem. And that I think is a very, very important point. And then all of that quantity, the figure, the PNL, it just goes down, it just evaporates into thin air. Because what a poem gives you is worth much more than all these figures put together. It actually helps you to put your life back together again, to relate to somebody who's had the same experience as you perhaps, and somebody who could express it for you, who you may not have been able to do so. And like you said, there are entire poems being shared in your inbox which are being read 150 and 200 times. And I think that's enormous. That's wonderful for poetry, because everybody who's reading it is definitely relating to it in some way if it's being circulated so well.
Sorry, if I may also butt in for a moment. When I say 152, I mean in my known circle. You can multiply that figure many times. And in fact, I also want to ask both of you that in that case, do you think that poetry that is curated by your friends actually is more likely to be read than by fixed volumes made by editors? Sorry, editors, I know some of you are out there.
Well, a poetry book which has been curated and has a whole lot of friend circle inputs in it is definitely, I think it's going to be read a little more, because the friend tells his or her friend and then it goes on. It's like the Chinese whisper. And also there's a certain vibe to it, If it's a completely unknown list of poets and authors, one might have to read each and every page to get a sense of it. So there's a preconditioning, there's a given when it's curated by a well-known editor or whoever, something like that.
No, so which is, and therefore in that situation what happens?
In that situation, a curated anthology does better.
A friend's curation or an editor's curation? No, come on, it doesn't matter, no one will, you're an editor yourself, so you know.
No, I think editor, friend, these are all boundaries that get permeated, down the line. Doesn't matter.
Fair enough. Okay, Naveen?
I'm all confused in the sense that there's a part of me that doesn't buy into the social media. Having said that, I am the one who tweets for Seagull Books. In other words, I tend to hide behind it and do that. It's the only social media platform I have. But I want to suggest a whole different way of looking at things, which is circulation, which is what you were talking about. Good old-fashioned letter writing to be read as emails or messages or whatever. And I find that the writing of poetry and even the circulation can actually be a very intimate act. For example, so many relationships with people that one doesn't really know across ages and languages that you carry on for years, a kind of correspondence in this very social media space. And then when you meet them, it's wonderful. It's like an endorsement of something. I have, for example, a relationship with a German writer who doesn't email, who doesn't do English. And I've accidentally happened to find him and acquire 6 of his books, which are a nightmare of translation. But we started writing letters to each other. Each letter costs between 600 and 800 euros. Because they're 30, 40 pages, the literary translation rate is about 100 euros per 1,000 words. I have to write my 30 pages of drivel, most of it is poetry, to this man. A literary translation in Berlin translates it, gives it to him. He writes his 30, 40 pages. It's wonderful. And all of it is for what? It's not really for publication. It's like a practice in the way I accidentally, in what I've been jokingly saying on social media, the late blooming of Naveen K, which is basically that after waiting patiently for 60 years to be discovered, I finally have a book of poems, which happened accidentally. But the writing happens like riyaz, like practice every day. It's a little music thing. Not because you don't want to share it, because you're sharing it intimately with a charmed group of friends, poets, students, all kinds of, anybody who shows any interest gets it, that kind of a. So I'm suggesting that there are ways, very personal, individual ways of circulation, which add to your numbers in a sense, so that, I don't think there's a formula to sharing of poetry.
No, sure. I mean, I'm just trying to put forward the idea that there is nothing about poetry that prevents people from reading it. Although you hear some people say, I don't understand poetry.
They don't understand art, but that's not
Yeah,
true.
but they love poetry nevertheless, because they're humming songs all the time, and that's poetry, right? And they can't claim that I don't understand those words. But so in that case, is it that we are applying the wrong metrics by trying to link trying to find an answer to who's reading poetry by trying to link it back to how many copies of books are being sold or how many page views websites containing poetry have? Maybe we're just looking at the wrong metric altogether. Is that possible?
See, just for your publishing related thing, which is, this phenomena of each book being a profit center is relatively new in terms of, it's 15 years old really. But traditional publishing, which is also still today, though it's under threat, practiced all across Europe, is that a handful of books will fund a huge crop of books. Everything cannot possibly be seen as a profit and loss. But today's publishing looks at it like a profit and loss, so a lot of wonderful books get shunted. They don't even become books. They get thrown out at the proposal, submission, manuscript level, because they don't look like you can make a profit out of them. When we're talking of the Seagull model, we have always, it's like a Satyajit Ray Apu trilogy we did in the 80s. It's kind of continually funding all sorts of stuff. All the Mahashvata Devis that sell are funding all kinds of Slovakian and Italian stuff that doesn't sell as well. It will eventually get around to it, is the belief and the hope. The thing about publishing of a certain independent, difficult, serious kind is that you have to, you have to wait patiently and believe in the fact that it will eventually find a buyer, which is all very well to say it like that breezily. It's not as easy in practice. The reason it works for us is because it's not about profits, it's about cash flow. If you can balance your books in a certain way that you can keep doing things without stopping, that's the thing. It's no magical formula. I always hear stories like, oh my God, these guys, look at the books they're publishing. They couldn't have more than 20 buyers, but how did they survive? They must have some unlimited wealth, or Naveen inherited it from his father. My poor father actually worked for Seagull at 600 rupees a month, which is a story for another festival. But, what I'm trying to say is that it's intent. It has to be intent. Sustainability has to do with content, not just profit and loss. Having said that, you obviously have to balance the books, and therefore you will, as a publisher, keep coming back to numbers, but it doesn't mean that you do it like a research, targeted, monitored, because then you're doctoring content, because I think he and she are going to read certain things, so I aim that. That sort of publishing also happens, but not poetry.
So I'm hopping on this point, but I find that today's means of distribution, technology-driven means, actually make it very easy for all of us to read poetry. I'm forever going to the Poetry Foundation website and discovering both favorites or rediscovering favorites, as well as finding new poets and newer writers. Or I find a great poem by a writer, by a new poet, and I then go and look up more poets without having to necessarily go and buy a book, which is not easy to get, and so on and so forth. So why are we worrying about whether anyone is reading poetry or not?
Not worrying at all. Are you worrying?
Are you worrying? So why? Why are you worrying? Yes. Yes.
Sorry. So actually, they conducted a survey with exactly this line, who reads poetry? And I've got this data from Google. It's also there on their website, and the whole data was sort of collated to bring out an anthology from University of Chicago. It was titled "The View from Here," where they mention all this. So it says that among all age groups, 25 to 34-year-olds had the highest rate of poetry reading, 12.3%, up from 6.7% in 2012. And women showed notable gains, 14.5% in 2017 from the 8% in 2012. So there's basically a 60% increase in the readership of poetry. So I'm not worried. I take back my words. But it was just a joke. But the thing is that COVID has, I have to bring in COVID here, because COVID has sort of brought back all the people back to these traditional means of gratification of the senses, one of which, very important one, is poetry. So somehow the entire world has pivoted towards poetry once again. No, I'm not worried about who reads poetry. There are so many new magazines which have cropped up, and that indicates that there's more poetry being published. And all of that is just indicating that, yes, poetry is thriving.
Listen, did you just change your stance in the course of your answer? Because you started out saying, I'm worried.
That's what I said, yeah. I changed my stand because it was just a one-line joke. No, I'm not worried, because I wanted to read out the data and prove to you that poetry is thriving. So, no, I'm not worried.
There you go, there you go. Okay, I have one last question for both of you before we take questions from the house. And that is, what if we were to frame this question slightly differently? Who's reading poetry as not which individuals or what kind of individuals or what demographics or so on, but who is the person who reads poetry? When do they read poetry? Why do they read poetry? How do they read poetry? And keeping in mind the fact that poetry is the longest surviving form of the written word, why will anyone ever stop reading poetry?
Yes,
And,
absolutely.
but don't give me feel-good answers. Actually tell me like it is.
Yes, so why will anybody stop reading poetry? Because there's something very mystical about poetry. And all of us have inside us a very sensitive core that may or may not show up in our lives, but it exists inside us. And poetry sort of nudges that core to life. And it kind of connects you to yourself. And I said this before, it helps you to process ideas and experiences. So everybody is eligible to read poetry. There are no boundaries whatsoever. And people do read poetry for self-gratification and the sensitive core being touched. And it's not about pleasure and enjoyment as far as poetry is concerned, like it might be in a painting, but it's more about connecting to yourself. It's almost a spiritual experience. That's what I would say.
Thank you, Naveen.
I agree with all of that. I don't have a real answer. I can sense the fact that in different times, different moods, different things happening to us, whether it's grief at one level, loss, love, whatever, excitement. So it is within the human sort of firmament to be able to want to reach out to something that is not spelled out as is prose, right? So we come back to this whole business of being able to sense something palpable under your skin, right? Whether it's in your head or arm or whatever. So therefore, I think that it's also something very personal that makes you find your way through the life that you lead. And that's very vital for people who wish to read poetry.
Okay, thank you. Are there any super urgent questions? I can see the organizers are saying there are no questions. Nobody can ask any questions. But I'm going to take one question defying them.
You have 2.5 minutes.
So yes, one question I'll take from the back, defying the organizers. Are editors reading poetry is the question.
This I can vouch for. We read every single poem. That's how we make our first of all, the long list and then the short list. Every submission has an average of 3 poems. Every single poem is read. Because that's the duty, you have to. When you've taken on that role, you can't take it lightly. So we read each and every single poem.
Right. Thank you. On that note, I'll just leave with the same advice I give my students. For every poem that you write, please read 1,000 poems by 1,000 different poets. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Arunava. Thank you. Thank you, Vinita.
Thank you. Thank you.